everyone to day 4 of this winter school on EU-Asia relations in multipolar world, organized by Manipal Center of European Studies in collaboration with Nordic Center in India. I'm Dr. Kachya, Assistant Professor at MCES. In this first session of day 4, we are here to discuss a very important topic today: international politics of climate change in EU-Asia relations. In recent years, climate change, it has shifted from being a very marginal political issue to one that has potentially transformative consequences for virtually all policy areas. The change in its political status has been remarkably rapid, but also very substantial. Today, when we are here to discuss this very important topic of international politics of climate change with regard to EU-Asia relations, especially in the background when EU has declared an ambitious target of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 under the European Green Deal, and has already displayed its aspiration to be a global leader in climate action. There's something that I cannot help but recall, a book that I recently read. The book is The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh. Now, the book per se doesn't say anything new that we already don't know. It somewhere states the very obvious, how climate change is related to the global distribution of power. Now, it's the simplicity of argument and the powerful way of storytelling of Amitav Ghosh that makes the whole book work. It argues that the dynamics of climate change today are rooted in a centuries-old geopolitical order constructed by Western colonialism. Now, as European colonists, they subjugated, they oppressed, they enslaved, killed and destroyed vast areas of Americas and Asia. They carried this mechanistic view of a supine nature across the world. And with this argument, Ghosh argues, it laid the foundation of everything that followed after that, from capitalism to climate change. Now, on this note, I invite our speaker today, Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram. A very warm welcome, Dr. Dhanasree. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Dhanasree to all of you. Dr. Dhanasree is an assistant professor at Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and co-coordinator, Center for Climate Studies at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. She is also a member of Climate Security Expert Network. She holds a PhD in Geopolitics and International Relations from Manipal University. She's also features editor at Manipal Advanced Research Group, Science, Technology and Security Forum, as well as Research Fellow, Earth System Governance Project. She's the author of Breaking Out of the Greenhouse, Indian Leadership in Times of Environmental Change, book published in 2012. And her recently released book is Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies, India as a Case Study. Once again, a very warm welcome, Dr. Dhanasree. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Yatharth, and thank you for giving that introduction to also looking at climate change from a very historical perspective, which today we tend to ignore, or we tend to overlook the historical bit, which is so important to discussing these issues in a much more nuanced manner, in fact. I will be dealing with some of these issues, and also I'll be looking into India's climate diplomacy in particular in this context, because it's very important to see where does India stand with respect to its climate diplomacy vis-a-vis EU's climate diplomacy, because this has like very larger sort of implications for Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region as well today. So EU-India climate diplomacy is something that will play a huge role in terms of how the international politics of climate change also plays in the next couple of decades, in fact. Thank you so much for inviting me to Manipal Center for European Studies with whom I've been associated for quite a while, and it's always a happy occasion to return to MCES and be associated with some of your wonderful events that you have been organizing. So I'll share my presentation now. Just a second. I hope you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, so as the topic says, international politics of climate change and EU-Asia relations. I think this is important because why Asia is, it's a question that we need to ask as well. Why Asia? Asia also includes China. Asia also includes Japan, Southeast Asia. And today, when we are talking about Indo-Pacific strategy, it's funny, where does really China feature in the Indo-Pacific strategy, right? So this is a question, I guess, you must have already sort of explored in some of the previous lectures of the workshop or of this course. So it would be interesting to see, when it comes to climate change as well, is it possible to have any strategy without China on board? This is a question that we need to ask, as much as we think of Indo-Pacific strategy and we try to bring up a policy which is more or less exclusionary towards China. How does that actually go well with the international politics of climate change or global climate governance, which is today, as I said, impossible without China's active engagement. So I will be focusing more on India-EU climate diplomacy, but as I mentioned, I'll also look into, like, for instance, when Yatharth mentioned about EU's Green Deal, and how does that tag into, say, India's Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released last year. These are all issues which we will look into. Apart from that, I will also look at the challenges, the future, what are the determinants, drivers, all these issues we will touch upon. Yeah, so 1 second. Oh, I'm sorry, just a second. I'm actually sharing one of the earlier files. Where is it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So before I kind of go into India-EU climate diplomacy, EU-Asia relations when it comes to climate cooperation, I thought of just reflecting a little bit upon climate diplomacy. What does it mean? I have kind of included this aspect, ideality and materiality. I don't know if you're going into the the theoretical aspects or the conceptual aspects, but I think it's important to see, where does climate diplomacy stand today when it comes to international relations itself? Why ideas are important, right? So, the more you explore climate diplomacy, what you would understand is that ideas form the crux of climate diplomacy of countries. Where your perceptions lie, what are the causes for climate change, what are the solutions that you propose for climate change. It all depends on the context. It depends on your perceptions around climate change. It depends on what your vulnerabilities are and how you understand these vulnerabilities. At the same time, materiality is equally important, where you talk about power politics. You talk about Indo-Pacific strategy and growing India-EU climate diplomacy. How does that really feed into the whole geopolitics, as we call it, of climate change itself, or the broader geopolitical consequences of climate change cooperation and conflicts? Because there are enough and more contestations around climate change as well, which also are reflective of the kind of international order that we are seeing. So many would say the recent Glasgow summit, which happened in November, December in 2021, was it a success, or was it something that again led to, like, one of these low-hanging fruits, as we call it, in climate in climate governance every year, except of course in 2020 the leaders couldn't meet, or the negotiations couldn't happen because of COVID situation. But every year otherwise there is a conference of parties that happens. So Glasgow again was reflective of where the problem lies with respect to our global climate governance goals. We haven't really been able to reach sort of universal consensus on how to go ahead with climate governance. So these are problems which we have to also look at when we talk about climate diplomacy. And India, EU, and are part of India, other Asian powers. They are all part of this order, or climate order, as we call it. Part of this international system where political or geopolitical dynamics have a huge role to play in what decisions are taken. So climate diplomacy, of course, draws heavily upon ideas of multilateralism, cooperation, all these, multilateralism, I suppose everybody knows, and I don't have to talk about it. But, it's the fact of the matter is, we constantly argue that climate change cannot be resolved without a multilateral agenda. Everybody needs to be part of it. You can't have like a coalition of the willing. Some countries are happy about cooperating while the rest of them don't. That's not possible. Because climate change is a transnational issue, it requires a much more concerted effort from every single actor, or every single nation state, as we call it in international relations. And then, as I mentioned, climate diplomacy is often a reflection of how geopolitics or power politics is perceived as well. So, when you see China and US coming together to form the G2. G2 in global climate governance was something that was big when Obama was the US president. Of course, that changed very fast when Trump came to power in the US. So very often climate diplomacy it doesn't operate like in some kind of exclusive realm. It operates within this geopolitical realm where these issues have a direct influence on how countries practice their climate diplomacy. So that is why it's very important to understand the geopolitical dynamics to see why countries choose a particular mode of action, or why they go ahead with certain statements, right? So this is something that also needs to be understood. So one of these commonly used definitions of climate diplomacy, in fact, it's why and how we need to think about international regimes. So of course the supreme regime, climate regime, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which we have had Conference of Parties, we have had Kyoto Protocol, and now we have the Paris Agreement, which is expected to be which is being implemented, as we call it, although on the financial market mechanisms are yet to be completely designed, but at least we have reached an agreement on the market mechanisms, which happened only at the Glasgow Summit. Anyway, so the idea is, how do you really construct this international regime? How do you effectively operate it? How do you implement it? And how do you address the emerging challenges to climate change? This is what climate diplomacy is all about. It's an interface between national interest debates. Of course, each country, each nation state has its own national interest. At the same time, there is also the push to international cooperation, because climate change is a global issue that requires international cooperation and multilateralism. And another issue that we need to keep in mind, climate diplomacy, unlike maybe other, various other traditional forms of diplomacy, it's not just nation state centric. There are various other actors, including non-governmental actors, sub-state actors, who also work to deliver international objectives. So today, when we talk about global climate governance, cities, for instance, have become a huge part of global climate governance. So Global Cities Alliance, for instance, it's something that are coming up to forge their own initiatives and their own measures in cooperation with each other, which may or may not be guided entirely by the the nation state, or say like the central or government or the federal government in some other cases. So how does climate diplomacy work? It works on three principles. One is to know yourself. we need to know, our own interests. You also need to know the other, because, that's the only way you can bargain and you can negotiate with the other party as to what the other's interests are. And the third principle is to capacity to influence, right? So whether you have the capacity to influence, whether your voices are going to be heard, say in a space like climate change negotiations, that is also determined by how much you know about yourself. And the knowledge is not just about, what are the impacts of climate change and the vulnerabilities. The knowledge is about what kind of institutions you can build domestically. What are these institutions going to do? How are they going to coordinate with each other? These are all issues which will also, which is why domestic politics is very, very critical to understanding climate diplomacy as well. There are various ways in which climate diplomacy operates. Bilateral is, we constantly talk about the multilateral part of the climate diplomacy agenda, but let's not forget that there is also bilateral climate diplomacy. There is also plurilateral, which is among, say, a few countries. There is minilateral, like, plurilateral, minilateral. There is also multiple bilateralism, for instance, where just as an example, how the US, China, EU equations have worked in the past. So not in the past alone, like especially during the Obama time, what happened was where US kind of reached out to China to have a common agreement before the Paris Agreement was reached. Similarly, EU and China as well, forged this kind of partnership to see how they can have a common position on climate change agreement at the Paris Summit. They also reached out to India, for instance, but with India, it was much more difficult to reach an agreement as compared to when they approached China before 2015, around 2014. So these are things where, this when a particular party engages in multiple bilateralism, where you try and reach out to, bilaterally reach out to multiple parties, which can have an overall effect on how the politics of climate change works at the international level. As I mentioned, there are multiple actors, state, sub-state, non-state, transnational actors. Very often, the governance that happens in climate change is called network governance. It's not like, a centralized sort of framework. There are other terms that are used as well, polycentric governance, where you have, many centers of power as well. But to say anything about how the Paris Agreement is currently being implemented, you can easily see that not many initiatives are actually being directed by the nation state. Other actors have kind of taken the lead in implementing many of the measures. Equity and climate justice, of course, these are the issues which, of course, are central to even India's climate diplomacy. So if you look at from history, 1992 onwards, India has been talking about equity, that is equitable distribution or equitable access to the carbon space, right? So because India and other developing countries haven't developed, most of the problem of climate change has been created by the developed countries. Therefore, there is the notion of historical responsibility that cannot be ignored. India also constantly talks about the per capita emissions principle. Why? Because India's per capita emissions is still way, way, way below in comparison to any other developed country. And our per capita emissions will actually, it can never really surpass that of the developed countries in the next 50, 60 years as we look at it, because our population is still quite big. There is also the aspect of vulnerability, developmental concerns, capabilities. Colonialism, as Yatharth also mentioned about colonialism, has a huge role to play as well, because today we talk about climate colonialism. This is a topic that we need to understand as well, because in the past, so much of resources have been extracted out of the developing countries, which helped these developed countries to become industrialized through the industrialization period, whereas the developing countries were left behind in that entire race for resources and development. There is also the scope for financial and technological assistance and all of that. Now, when you look at India's position in this international global or climate governance regime, there's always this thought that India has always acted as a spoiler. So even in the recent Glasgow summit, on the last day when India put up its position that we should replace phase out of coal to phase down of coal. One of the reaction was that, yeah, as usual, India just spoiled the entire conference by making this last minute demand. So, I mean, we'll go to the politics of that as well, because India is not the only country that actually demanded it. It's just that the Indian representative is the one who mentioned it. But this is the same position which was endorsed by all the G20 countries. It just looked like India is the only one asking for it in the end. In fact, China had asked for it before, but China usually kind of, stays behind India in the negotiation space, which we can talk about if anybody is interested. But at the same time, you can see that since the Copenhagen Summit in 2009, there's been a shift in India's approach towards climate diplomacy, that India needs to become a bridging nation between developed and developing countries. It needs to represent the interests of the developing countries. At the same time, it needs to be seen as a part of the solution. So this idea of leadership is something that had a huge impact on India's climate diplomacy, that we need to become a global leader in climate change. We shouldn't be seen as a problem. We shouldn't be lagging behind as far as, having a position on the global high table of governance is concerned. This is also relevant to India's quest for a position in the UNSC as well, because the more legitimacy comes with your leadership on issues such as climate change, which will, the idea is that at some point this will translate into more power, say a position in the UNSC and other things. Yes, climate diplomacy is also linked with economic opportunities, strategic partnerships, development cooperation. So today, when we talk about financial aid, of course, much of this financial aid is also very biased because what should be available as grants very often gets provided in the form of loans with interest and other things, which itself actually shows a form of colonialism itself, a continued sort of perpetuation of colonialism. But climate diplomacy is now, that's why we call that, we have this phrase called climatization, that overall of most areas of global governance today are being climatized, that we have more and more linkages being drawn between trade and climate change, human rights and climate change, economics and climate change, development cooperation and climate change. All kinds of issues are being linked with climate change today. And that is some form of this climatization of global governance itself. So today, almost every agreement, a joint statement, bilateral joint statement or agreements, or G20 summit or whichever may be, clubs, other kinds of organizations, they all have emphasis laid on climate change as an area of cooperation. No matter what climate change could be mentioned, at least rhetorically, even if it doesn't kind of translate into effective or a practical sort of cooperation, rhetorically, climate change has become like a pervasive subject. And like I mentioned, there are also power hierarchies in the international system, which get reflected in how climate diplomacy is practiced. And of course, for most countries, it is also a tool for soft power projection. Right, so this is used for strategic purposes as well. Like India has launched the International Solar Alliance, which also kind of builds on its diplomatic overtures towards mostly developing countries. But now you can see even the United States has joined the International Solar Alliance, which is a huge achievement because remember that ISA is a treaty-based organization, and usually if you I don't know if you have looked into US historical behavior on international agreements, they normally stay away, I'm not saying overall, but they normally stay away from treaty-based kind of agreements because that has to be ratified in the Senate and the Congress, which is very, very difficult in the case of US. But they have gone ahead and signed the ISA, which was also remarkable in the sense it also shows India's leadership and ability to push forth its agenda on climate diplomacy. to kind of, very briefly talk about drivers of India's climate diplomacy and how does India see itself, say, in the broader gamut of EU-Asia relations on climate cooperation or whatever, broader like sustainability cooperation. So these are ideas which I have talked about in my book that Yatharth mentioned about, climate diplomacy in emerging economies, India as a case study. So many issues that I mentioned earlier also, you can say that India's climate diplomacy is kind of influenced by moral issues like equity, justice, environmental issues, because India is a highly vulnerable country when it comes to climate change, socio-economic issues, because India is still a developing country and requires a large amount of financial and technological assistance to achieve its climate goals. Cultural and political. Why cultural is important is because India is a country that has constantly talked about climate change as a kind of a civilizational issue as well. So it talks about the position of India as the civilizational leader as well, that India has always talked about sustainable development as a part of its ethos, and that nobody has a right to teach us what climate action means. So this is something that has constantly also irked the European Union and European countries, that India constantly talks about the fact that, okay, we don't need your lessons on how to protect environment. We've been doing this forever. You are doing it now, which is why you think this is fairly complex. But we have been doing it. It's part of our culture. It's part of our civilizational ethos. Now, these are kind of statements you constantly find being mentioned in various forums. In fact, China also does that to some extent, where it talks about the whole idea of ecological civilization, which was introduced by Hu Jintao, but is also being pushed by Xi Jinping, and geopolitical ideas, which are already covered. Now, one question we need to ask is it like a subset of India's foreign policy, right? So very often, we think of climate diplomacy as something that is separate from foreign policy. This is something that is much broader. It needs to have different sorts of principles and guidelines and all of that. But if you look at India's climate diplomacy, it is more or less a subset of its foreign policy. Like, it wants to achieve its foreign policy goals through its climate diplomacy measures, whatever positions it is taking at the international level. So, which is quite evident in the way, for instance, non-alignment, especially during the early part of the negotiations in the 90s, it sort of found its own way, right? So it wanted to have a position which is not really aligned to, say, one particular group of countries, or, it wanted to form its own position, say, among the developing countries, the G77, which is a group of developing countries and all of that. Strategic autonomy, yeah, we don't need to be, India shouldn't be dictated, no term should be dictated to India. In fact, as one of the examples that I mentioned, when 2014 Obama went to China, signed an agreement on climate change, where China also agreed to peak its emissions before 2030. Obama then came to India, expected India also to sort of sign an agreement, but in the meeting, it was clarified that India cannot agree to peak its emissions, because again, China is way ahead in terms of its emissions. So you can't really equate India with China in that respect. Sovereignty, South-South cooperation is more like about cooperation among developing countries, rules-based, so-called global order, based on security, stability, sustainability. These are all issues which are critical to India's foreign policy, which you will also find reflected in India's climate diplomacy positions itself. So this is why the relevance of Copenhagen Summit is very important, because that was like a turning point in the politics of climate change itself. Because the Copenhagen Summit is where the basic countries, that is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, took the lead in terms of negotiating an agreement, which of course was not acceptable to everyone, which is why Copenhagen Summit is considered one of the biggest disasters of climate change negotiations, which did not lead to any important agreement. But however, subsequently, of course, a lot of changes, a lot of measures were taken. And as I mentioned, China's joint statements with US and EU is something that we need to understand did play a big role in the in the Paris Agreement in particular. The fall of basic, why it's important to sort of look at fall of basic is because over a period of time, you will find that, these four countries, they just went their own ways. So, China found its own partners. Brazil, Brazil had, it's a very, very, very interesting country to study. Like, I'm not really going to that because it's not part of this lecture. South Africa, of course, because of its regional leanings and, had to be seen as a part of the Africa group rather than being, associated too much with India and China, all of that. So the tag of responsible power is something that that did guide India's policy on climate change, that we need to be seen as a responsible power at the international level. So you can see some of these images at the Copenhagen Summit, basically the disgruntled faces of EU leaders, because they were completely sidelined during the Copenhagen Summit. So they were supposed to lead the process, but with all the politics that went behind closed doors, what happened is that the basic countries took the lead. And this was seen as a watershed moment that way, because for the first time, you saw emerging economies, developing countries, took the lead and kind of sidelined the normative sort of powers, because the EU is always seen as a normative power in terms, especially when it comes to climate change related issues. This is another image here which shows, Obama reaching out to, this is 2009 Copenhagen Summit, reaching out to the Chinese premier. And just behind him, you can see like Jayaram Ramesh, who was leading India's negotiations at that point in time. So clearly it was like one of these moments when the developed countries actually reached out to the developing countries. So these images, kind of speak volumes about how politics of climate change has worked in the past as well. As I mentioned, some of these kind of agreements, like, especially China, US, EU, India, this equation has had a huge influence on how the politics of climate change has evolved. And you'll find that over a period of time, many agreements have been signed. Of course, with the US, there was a lull during the Trump era. But during Obama's period, and now you can see even with Biden coming to power, irrespective of what's going on between US and China, you saw that both countries ended up signing a bilateral agreement on the sidelines of the Glasgow Summit. So, no matter what, having a confrontational position on climate change is not seen as something ideal, right? So you don't want to be seen as a villain, like a climate villain, right? So especially China and India have always been, kind of been shown as these climate villains, although the real climate villains are the developed countries who have done very little to resolve the problem, right? But China and India have constantly been shown as climate villains. So you don't want to be seen as climate villain. You don't want to be seen as, confrontational on climate diplomacy. So you will find that irrespective of all other geopolitical rivalries that exist, you still want to be seen as cooperating on climate change. So these are some of the cases. Then India, you can see it's also, has been equally kind of, so yes, India is cooperating with EU and US and others. It's also cooperating with the other developing countries. So you have BASIC as one of the example. Then, you have also BRICS is another example. Of course, Russia is part of that. G77 is a group of developing countries with whom India has been cooperating as well. And finally, you also have the like-minded developing countries, which, by the way, doesn't include Brazil and South Africa. So that's that's like the interesting part, that because the BASIC wasn't really working well, India had to kind of shift its energy towards other groups like-minded developing countries. So if I have spoken about most of these issues that India has always kind of demanded for greater attention to adaptation, climate finance, loss and damage. Actually, India hasn't pressed for it much. I can answer this question if at all you're interested. Why doesn't it push for it? But there are these, constant demands by most of Asian. This is not just India. In fact, most of the Asian countries have been demanding for greater attention to the adaptation, climate finance, and other issues. CBDRRC, which is the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities and national circumstances, right? This is an important principle of climate diplomacy. In global climate governance, any negotiations actually work on this principle. So the differentiation between developed and developing countries should not be diluted at any cost. Now, this is a position that is uncompromisable for all the developing countries. Yes, there is also increasing signs of vulnerabilities and also the need for unbiased and regionally focused scientific knowledge about climate change. So for a long time, countries like India and other developing countries have depended on the developed countries for knowledge about climate change, because that's where all the climate modeling is happening. That is where most of the studies are happening. So increasingly, there was a need felt, even in countries like India and other developing countries, we need to produce our own knowledge to understand these vulnerabilities. We should not depend on the West to understand them, because there will always be bias in their understanding of these issues as well. We have seen how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also, in fact, some of their findings were questionable. In fact, India also questioned some of its findings on the melting of Himalayan glaciers. Eventually, India conducted its own study and said that that finding was wrong. And this is in fact when Rajesh Pachauri was the IPCC Director General when this happened. Interestingly, where India and EU have kind of converged is the fact that most of the climate change measures have co-benefits. So whatever mitigation efforts you want to adopt, right? So climate mitigation means reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The idea is that it will have co-benefits. So, I mean, just to give us an example, when we talk about renewable energy expansion, right? So renewable energy expansion, of course, this is a climate mitigation measure, but it also helps improving energy security, access to affordable energy through decentralization and other efforts. So it's basically co-benefits of climate mitigation that India and other developing countries started to focus on more than ever before. And to some extent, India also, kind of stopped hiding behind this low per capita emissions argument, because India realized that it is not going to sell at the international level anymore. It needs to do more than what it is doing. It needs to, in this respect, actually, personalities like Jayaram Ramesh, for instance, did play a huge role. In fact, he was criticized heavily for even like announcing voluntary emissions reduction targets at the Copenhagen Summit and even at the Durban Summit, where India did take upon its shoulders, basically voluntary emissions reduction targets. And this was not received well domestically, but internationally, in fact, this did push India's image as a responsible power and a country that is ready to take this moral high ground or whatever. So this is an important thing, and this is where actually the shift happened. Like post 2009, you can see that this is where India's cooperation with EU also started to gain more momentum. That India is now ready to focus on implementable, pragmatic, and results-oriented solutions. Rather than looking at these ideational contestations as to how equity should be operationalized, how do we ensure justice. These are issues that started to sort of take the back seat slowly but surely. And this is where India also, like 2014, when Narendra Modi came to power, Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power, he decided that from taking over from Manmohan Singh government, actually that shift started during Manmohan Singh government, and then eventually, of course, Modi also decided that India should be seen on the global high table. So that's where International Solar Alliance, for instance, has a huge role to play in that respect. So what is India-EU climate diplomacy, right? So EU traditionally has always supported this kind of top-down approach that, you should have targets and timetables. That is why the Kyoto Protocol was actually based on that, So UNFCCC will kind of designate these targets, and then all countries have to achieve those targets within a certain schedule, right? So unlike the top-down approach, India has always sort of been interested in a bottom-up approach where countries come up with their own nationally determined contributions and then achieve it. So Paris Agreement is a classic bottom-up sort of agreement, which is based on nationally determined contributions and not like a targets and timetables approaches. But overall, if you see, India, EU have converged towards the clean development mechanism through which a lot of, India has got a lot of credits, and through which technology transfer has also happened. Finances have been transferred as well. So energy, climate action, renewable energy cooperation, all these issues are where, like, also public-private partnerships are the areas in which both these players have converged over a period of time. And I think it's also important that EU realize that it needs to kind of shift away from one size fits all. And I think that is an important lesson that EU learned when it came to its relations with Asian countries, that you can't have like India and China just clubbed into one. So, when I interviewed some of the EU representatives who participated in the negotiations for my book, they said for a long time, they felt that, oh, if you just talk to the Chinese negotiators, that means you can understand the Indian negotiators as well. That was the approach that they adopted. I think they understood that this is not how it works, and they need to have a separate strategy for each of these countries. And that clearly had an impact on how the EU's approach towards Asia as a whole also changed over a period of time. And then, of course, India's ambitious renewable energy targets is something that kind of changed the way the EU looked at the possibilities of cooperation, opportunities for cooperation that India's renewable energy in particular sector offers to EU, in terms of investments and other things. Very importantly, some countries within EU had already started kind of, improving their bilateral relations with India, whether it's France, Germany. These countries have obviously been a little more proactive when it comes to enhancing their partnerships or relationships with India. So in effect, you can find that from Copenhagen to the Paris Agreement or Paris Summit in 2015, the relationship between India and EU kind of shifted from confrontational to more of a cooperative stance, which is something that needs to be acknowledged. So there are other areas like, so there are target specific areas of cooperation, like within the National Action Plan on Climate Change of India, which has played a huge role in, whatever executive policy that we have brought about. And EU is also interested in some of the key areas like energy and water and other issues. There's also increasing focus on adaptation, which is something that is being pushed forward by the GIZ, which is the Developmental Cooperation Agency of Germany, and sustainable and climate resilient agriculture. So if you look at the India-EU climate diplomacy, some of the agreements signed, so agriculture is one of these areas, water shortage is another one, integration of climate action and SDGs, because sustainable development goals, which were also proposed in 2015, Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, another major international framework which came out in 2015. So increasingly, countries are also talking about how all these three frameworks need to be integrated because they have so many common goals itself. And of course, if you look at India's policies like Make in India today, we have Atmanirbhar Bharat, Smart Cities Mission, other initiatives. There is an opportunity. I mean, although we are not doing it as of now, but there is at least an opportunity to mainstream climate concerns in development planning. So, at least rhetorically, you can see that these are mentioned in all the policies, but we have to wait and see how it's going to be implemented. Now, this is where EU's Green Deal also happens to find a major position, because EU's Green Deal is not just a kind of a EU-centered deal. Of course, it talks about becoming climate neutral by 2050. It talks about protecting human life, animals, plants, all of that, helping companies become world leaders in clean products and technologies. So this is something that has been, again, seen as a major deal which Of course, in the wake of COVID pandemic as well. So the whole idea of green recovery is something that is being pushed as part of the EU's Green Deal as well, European Green Deal. Now, there are several problems with the EU's Green Deal as well, because it also tends to focus a lot more on technologies and other things, wherein the question of the question of finances, climate finance, has still not very clear as to how some of these finances are going to be transferred from the global north to the global south. There are, age-old, long-standing broken promises with respect to climate finance that should have come from industrialized countries to developing countries. In fact, even when India declared its targets at the Glasgow Summit, clearly said that this totally sort of depends on depends on climate finance. If climate finance doesn't flow into the developing countries, how are these goals going to be achieved? Now, these are questions which the Green Deal hasn't been able to completely address, which is of course something that also, there are other laws which I'll come to, which may be tagged to European Green Deal, especially in terms of sustainable, making value chains, right? So supply chains more and more sustainable. How does that affect EU's relations with the rest of the world, especially Asian countries, which are still dependent on trade and other means of development, right? So this is something that we will remain as a challenge because it's fairly new. We have to wait and see how it's going to be implemented. There is also the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, very interestingly, if you look at EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, again, climate change is a major part of it. So, in fact, EU's Indo-Pacific strategy mentions sustainable development goals, Paris Agreement, Convention on Biological Diversity. It talks about deepening engagement with the Asian countries, including all the ASEAN countries, India, Japan, South Korea. So it talks about all that. There are seven priority areas mentioned under the Indo-Pacific strategy, which includes sustainable and inclusive prosperity, green transition, ocean governance, digital governance and partnerships, connectivity, security and defense, and human security. So again, you can see how climate change is going to be a major part of its priority in the Indo-Pacific, right? So overall, EU is interested in, say, various kinds of initiatives, including like the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is started by India and China. There's also Asia-Europe Connectivity Vision Document 2025. Then, of course, EU is also interested in Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific and US Indo-Pacific strategy, India's security and growth for all in the region. So there are so many, partnerships that are there for infrastructure, renewable energy, existing ones which the EU wants to now capitalize on. So instead of forging its own sort of strategic kind of a framework, it's probably, what the EU is looking to do is to tap into these existing frameworks, which, by the way, require a lot more momentum if we are to achieve several goals. So Indo-Pacific strategy is something that will serve as a major part of EU's climate cooperation with Asian countries. I've just included this example of EU-ASEAN climate diplomacy. You can see as part of the EU Green Deal, in fact, the European Green Deal, it has also talked about, one of the, I don't know if this was touched upon in the lecture on EU-ASEAN. In fact, one of the biggest bottlenecks, or you can say irritants, I would say, in EU-ASEAN climate diplomacy is palm oil, right? So palm oil, these plantations are huge in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. They are exceedingly dependent on the revenues generated from the palm oil. The EU, just a couple of years ago, in fact, they created a lot of furor among the Southeast Asian countries when EU said that it's going to phase out palm oil in biofuels. Now, EU is one of the biggest buyers of palm oil from these countries, right? So So instead of finding a solution to deforestation, which is being caused by the palm oil plantations, the EU rather, the thought of just imposing a ban, which did not go down well with the Southeast Asian countries. In fact, Malaysia, I can't exactly remember, either Malaysia or Indonesia, one of them, in fact, even said that, if the EU goes ahead with this decision, then we may pull out of the Paris Agreement. Because this actually goes against the principle of CBDR, RC, common but differentiated responsibility. You are supposed to give us finances to deal with this kind of deforestation issues. And we have, these countries also argued that instead of going with a ban, they should ideally be focusing on sustainability certification and other things through which this issue can be tackled. Right, so EU from time to time. So today, of course, there are other issues also. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is also being seen. Of course, this is trying to kind of target trade. That's why I said this increasingly this climatization that is happening, where climate change is being seen as an integral component of most of the sectors. Right, so the carbon the border adjustment mechanism, again, this is to make all the supply chains and everything more sustainable in nature. But the problem is, do these other countries, are they ready for it? You can bring in a law at the EU level, but what about the other countries? Do they have the capacity to do that? Do they have the resources to do that? What about their own legal? What about the legal issues within these countries? What are the developmental concerns of these countries? Right. So this is where, palm oil is just one example, but you can find that the EU is constantly sort of now toying with these ideas of linking trade with climate change more and more. So another area in which they are also like I mentioned, they're trying to reduce emissions through its carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to be a major challenge as well. But you will find that through the EU Green Deal, at least they are saying that they are claiming that at least they're going to help ASEAN countries with smart cities, biodiversity conservation, sustainable use of peatlands. Peatlands are the ones which are burnt to cultivate palm oil plantations, and the peatlands are like the highest. They are like the biggest reservoirs of carbon, right? So that obviously kind of releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, leading to more and more climate change. So these are some of the issues that will continue to irritate EU's relations with the Asian countries. These are some of the initiatives that were, the initiatives which you can say were declared recently. When India decided to finally sort of declare its net zero target by 2070, and then all the other renewable energy targets. The blueprint is not yet ready as to how this is going to be achieved. But at least, again, this is more, as I mentioned, more of a rhetorical intention to show that India is serious about dealing with climate change at the international level. Also, at the Glasgow Summit, the One Sun, One World, One Grid was launched by UK and India. So UK is another important player when it comes to climate diplomacy of India and within Europe. So, this particular initiative is, it actually seeks to form this mega renewable energy grid, which will connect various regions. And this is something that will also be led by the International Solar Alliance. This is again just something that is being envisaged. So I'll conclude now. There are various factors which have brought EU and India together and also has influenced EU's relations with the other Asian countries, right? So the Trump factor obviously did play a big role. So when Trump came to power in US, so during Obama's time, India and China, both of them had forged deep relations with US. I wouldn't say deep, but at least they had started that process of cooperating on climate change, very importantly on renewable energy and other issues. When Trump came to power, India and China both had to look at other partners, and EU was seen as EU was the partner which was ready to engage with these countries, unlike how, what happened or what happened at the Copenhagen Summit in 2009. The China factor is important as well today, especially since the COVID pandemic. What is happening is there's increasing skepticism, right, about China. What can China do? But at the same time, it's not possible to have a climate agreement without China in it. So, because it is, after all, the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. And then comes EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, which I think will pave the way for greater cooperation on climate change between the EU and Asian countries. All platforms are equally important. Why I reiterated that, yes, multilateralism and in the international climate change negotiations, the UNFCCC, yes, that is an important forum, but it has its own limits, as we have seen in how these negotiations have progressed so far. Therefore, climate diplomacy today will sort of also be guided by bilateral and other forums as well, as much as these multilateral forums. Challenges to India-EU cooperation, as I mentioned, is of course intellectual property rights over technology. This has been there since the beginning, and I don't think I need to even talk about it, because there are still a lot of issues when it comes to manufacturing of green technology. This is a problem that India has with all developed countries. I mean, there have been multiple cases filed by US companies against India, even on solar energy, solar panels and other things, because India generally tends to mass manufacture the solar panels, which goes against some of the WTO regulations and other things. So multiple times India's companies, and India has, cases have been filed against Indian companies as well by US, and of course EU is also very protective when it comes to the IPR regime. Trade-related differences, as I mentioned, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is just one among several measures that are being brought about by the EU to integrate climate change concerns more and more into their trade, and that's a really problematic scenario, because EU, if you look at most of the consumer goods come from other countries. So if you're going to impose these kind of legislations, how that's going to affect the other countries is something that needs to be looked into more deeply. And I think Yatharth and Priya have written an article on this as well, which I'm sure can be a good starting point, at least for discussion. Then regulatory environment is very important as well, because very often, even though there is money to be taken for various projects, because the regulatory environment in India is so complex and with so much of red tape and so much of bureaucracy, it actually delays action on many urgent issues. And this has been a constant problem that I have come across in my research also, that there is money to be taken, but because of all the concerns, it doesn't happen at the national level. At the same time, climate finance from EU, of course, it is increasing, but it is still way below expectations, as one can imagine. Yes, increasingly India, EU, some of the other Asian countries in the Indo-Pacific, minus China, of course, is looking at prospects of this belt of development justice. So without compromising development. So climate action, which also takes into consideration developmental imperatives, and a climate responsible international development cooperation. So climate change is a major part of development cooperation of the EU as well. So overall, you can say that, especially if you look at India-EU climate diplomacy, it has moved from some kind of ideological contestation to more of a pragmatic cooperation, right? So issues on which both can cooperate and kind of not being preoccupied with these differences that have existed for a long time. So so I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions and comments or anything that you might have come across in your own, I don't know, research or works. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dhanasree, for your very informative and comprehensive lecture on climate diplomacy and its various dimensions. We are now open for question and answer. I request all the winter school participants, please, you can post your question in the chat box. You can also raise your hand, unmute yourself and speak. We have almost half an hour for this question and answer session. We will try and wrap it up by 1:30. Please go ahead. Who wants to go first? Are there any hands raised? Because otherwise I have a question which I'm like really
Okay,
You can start. You can start. I'm still
you're still thinking?
forming the question.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right. So let me start. There is one country which I really want to know about, and it's it's China. What exactly it is doing when it comes to climate diplomacy? Because when it comes to almost every other area, it's challenging the West on almost at every stage. So how it is approaching this whole issue of climate? It does, is it looking for again global leadership when it comes to climate governance? What exactly is it? It's China's position.
Yeah. So China's actually emergence sort of or at least being seen as a global climate leader. I don't know why it is seen as that, but yeah, this is something that is at least there in the discourse. You can find that China is much more serious about climate change than India. That's what it looks like when you read much of the discourse on climate related issues. And that's really like something that also surprises me, how that kind of shift happened, I mean, China's interest in climate governance started, around the same time as India started looking at climate diplomacy as an area of interest, right? So something that we need to be more serious about. It had a lot to do with, of course, also the, domestically, China was facing a lot of environmental protests in response to, various development projects like dams in particular became like a huge concern for much of the local populations. And environmental protests were one type of protest which were allowed by the Chinese Communist Party. So they did not really quell these protests. At the same time, there was also issues of smog. So some of the Chinese cities are the worst polluted cities in the world. So smog is something that became a major concern for Chinese economy, the public health and other things, which also was taken very seriously by, the Chinese leadership, that, one way of probably tackling it. So the idea of co-benefits, right? So that if you tackle smog, you will also tackle climate change, right? So you can also kind of mitigate climate change by, say, shutting down the coal plants around Beijing, or something like that. So the fossil fuel projects in and around various cities were asked to scale down their operations, or they were shut down because of the smog, which also helped with climate mitigation, right? So air pollution and environmental protests and, kind of movements did have a huge role to play in China's sort of assertiveness on climate change over a period of time. But more than that, again, it's about this leadership at the global level. So China wants to be assertive and, and wants to be seen as a leader on climate change. It wants to be seen as you mentioned, wants to contest the Western ideas of how climate mitigation should be carried out. So it started to invest in renewable energy projects massively. Like at around 2010-11, China became like the biggest investor in renewable energy, surpassing even US, Germany, and other countries. So this is like the story that continues to be the same. It hasn't changed. China still actually dominates the mineral value chain, like the minerals that you require to carry out this massive energy transition and electric vehicles transition and all these transitions. So you need a lot of rare earths, which again is dominated by China today. So with that, of course, it has a hold on the solutions to climate change as well, which is why most countries cannot ignore China when it comes to global climate governance. At the same time, there is a lot of misconception around what China is doing. So, for a long time, in fact, you will find that, for a long time, China was continuing. So while it was scaling down its fossil fuel projects domestically to show itself as more responsible, it was investing in fossil fuel projects outside of China, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in Africa. So it continued to invest heavily. So all the others, these, so-called international financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF, at one point they started to, they started to scale down their investments in fossil fuel projects because of the pressure. So China came in as, replacement. So China started to invest through the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative in particular. And then again, pressure started mounting on China to stop its fossil fuel investments abroad. And that is why you will find recently they have started with this idea of green BRI. So they are talking about how they're going to invest in more and more renewable energy projects. They're going to, of course, they also announced that they will not invest in fossil fuel projects abroad. They also said that all the projects that they're going to carry out under BRI will follow certain, like, environmental sustainability standards and everything. But remember that these standards are their own standards. It's not like, something which is matching with international sustainability standards or something. Even on extractive, even the Chinese extractive industry have their own standards on how minerals are extracted for these renewable energy projects. So these are again problems which you can find. So, but the Trump factor, when until the Paris Agreement was signed and was implemented, and so you saw that Obama had suddenly sort of catapulted himself as this leader. Although, there's a lot of hypocrisy in that as well, because he did that in like 1 year. Before that, he was not very serious about climate change either. His hands were tied because of the US administration and how it works. I'm not saying he was responsible for it, but because, as I mentioned, the Congress, the Senate, all these other actors are, very active and very strong about their opposition to certain agreements, at least when it comes to climate change. So that gave the space for China to kind of show itself. When Trump came to power and said climate change is, it's a hoax or whatever. So that gave China the position to say that no, we are going to replace the US as a global climate leader. We are going to do everything. We are going to do a lot more than other countries. We will implement the Paris Agreement no matter what. So this kind of gave that legitimacy to China, at a very crucial point of time. And EU also was, EU's hands were tied as well, because EU was kind of banking on US contribution to the climate regime. And when kind of Trump said that, okay, we are no longer going to be part of the Paris Agreement, EU reached out to China. There was no other choice. It had to be an EU-China combined, which would then guide the global climate regime. Of course, India is an important player, but still in terms of the power politics, as we call it, it's still behind China and China in respect to these issues. So, and because of China's, increasing sort of investments in renewable energy and other kinds of technologies, because China is now also kind of, trying to be this superpower and technological revolution, AI and fourth industrial revolution, as I mentioned. So in all these issues, it just looked like it is trying to project itself as this major kind of contender. But as I mentioned, this is more of rhetoric than actually what is going on, because China's contributions to climate change is going to be massive. So whatever China has been emitting in the past 20 years is going to be there and is going to change the climate for the next thousands of years. So whatever happens today, that is why we need to see that China shouldn't be seen together with India, because I think in terms of culpability, China is still way ahead. So there is a lot of politics to how China has presented itself and how it has been engaging with countries. And today, China doesn't want climate finance. That's a crucial point as well. It doesn't want any finance from developed countries. It doesn't ask for it. Instead, China is providing finance to developing countries, right? So that is a huge shift. India hasn't reached that stage to do that. Yes, we are providing, but at a very, very minimal level. It's a limited thing, and we still need climate finance, which has been made clear, right? So that is a shift that definitely shows China, as this responsible power. But yeah, you have to like take it with a pinch of salt. Yeah.
Just one follow-up question to that, and then we'll move to Hitesh. So you said China doesn't want any climate finance. So can we say that its position in recent years is kind of shifted away from what developing countries are demanding? The whole idea of your common but differentiated responsibilities and
To
respective.
some extent, yes. In fact, so it still stands with G77 countries. Demanding equity, justice, climate finance, technology, all of that. So still, you will find China's name in all these joint statements with developing countries. Basic countries also meet every year, although I don't know what they are able to do practically. But joint statements again mention all these issues, which are, as I mentioned, central to climate change regime. At the same time, you can also see that even at the recent Glasgow summit, China was the one that put forth this coal phase down clause much before India did. They are not ready to phase down coal as of now. So because coal is still mainstay for China as well. It's a huge contributor to China's energy security, right? So yes, it's trying to balance between these two kind of positions. Yes, it wants to be seen as a developing country when it's convenient for its demands, and at the same time being seen as like the superpower or great power or whatever, when it's convenient to say that, yeah, we are there, now we are ready to challenge the West and replace the West as whatever, like, the center of global governance.
Thank you. Hitesh, you may go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for your lecture and presentation. It was really thought-provoking to some extent. Yeah, it was. My question was, if as you mentioned, in a recent conference, India proposed to curb the consumption of coal, and China has done that before. And since there is a common ground, like on these, at least on this part between India and China, why don't we see enough cooperation between these two countries? Is it just like an ideological part, or if there is just ideology, is there is anything else apart from ideology that is keeping the hold?
So so recently I gave this lecture on Sino-Indian climate diplomacy, and yeah, you are right, most of the cooperation that has happened so far is ideological. Yeah, because of developing country status, focus on CBDRRC, equity, historical responsibility, justice. All these issues have been at the center of cooperation between India and China, which is also, you can see the same kind of cooperation happening on the trade related issues as well. At the international level, they want to be seen as more together. But at the bilateral level, it's not like India and China haven't signed agreements on climate change. There have been bilateral agreements. There have been agreements on renewable energy cooperation and other issues also. Especially in the past couple of years with a lot of these border conflict, and COVID is another issue which has come in the way. The level of cooperation is definitely not as it was envisaged before. So, of course, one of the problems with the cooperation that was happening between India and China was that our market got flooded with solar panels manufactured in China, right? And then all of a sudden, when during this border conflict, and of course with COVID also, the Chinese manufacturers just raised the price of the solar panels. So last year, our own renewable energy industry was massively hit because the prices of those Chinese solar panels went up. So this kind of dependence is also not good, right? So almost 80% of the solar panels, as far as I know, in India are manufactured in China. So, okay, forget about manufacturing the solar panels, and we manufacture our own solar panels. Still, we will depend on China massively because all the constituent units of the solar panels are manufactured in China. The minerals come from China, whatever. Like, so in a sense, there is no possibility of India carrying out its climate change, like whatever goals it has set for itself, without Chinese cooperation. It's not possible as of now, unless as we are talking about Quad today. So Quad is talking about diversification of supply chains, mineral value chains, because we have seen in the past how China, kept, in fact, the Japanese as hostage when, not as hostage, like Japan. When they banned the export of rare earths to Japan because of the East China Sea dispute, when there was a conflict between the two countries. So China does use its minerals and the dominance in this sector as a way of it's like a strategic asset for them. They'll use it at any point in time, right? So that's why these geopolitical factors will constantly play into whether it's China-Japan cooperation or China-India cooperation. So we have signed agreements, but besides this whole international level cooperation on these ideological issues that we hold, which are similar, other than that, at the practical level, the cooperation has kind of been subdued by the geopolitical issues itself.
Yes, Gauri, go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you. Ma'am, who's the?
Sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you, ma'am. I really enjoyed the session. So my question to you is regarding India's R&D capacity. Basically, how much we invest in our R&D and how that probably is again affecting our renewable energy capacities. So how do you think we should go about this, and how collaboration with EU can probably help at this place? Thank you.
No, R&D is definitely one area where India and EU can collaborate. And I think that is where most of the focus is on that only, besides investments in, say, climate mitigation, adaptation projects in India. So remember that, so climate finance is not just with the state actors, right? So climate finance is coming also from the private actors in EU, like pension funds and other things also. There is a lot, there's a lot that is happening through other actors also. So yes, investment, and like you mentioned, R&D is definitely an area where India is collaborating already with the EU. Like there is a lot of university partnerships, research institutes are collaborating with each other. The government is also showing interest in these issues. India's, of course, capacity, if you talk about R&D, it's dismal. So even otherwise, I'm like, India's investments in R&D is hardly 1% of the GDP or whatever. So the budgetary allocation for R&D is very, very low. So yes, our budgetary allocation for renewable energy and other clean technologies is, of course, very low, as if you take the overall picture. To change it, yes, we will have to collaborate with countries like US, EU, and I think with the US, of course, what is that? I forgot. There was this fellowship, Kalam Climate Protection Fellowship or something like that, under which actually cooperation has been happening for some time, irrespective of whether, although Trump was in power, still it was going on, because these are things that are floated by the bureaucracy, doesn't really depend on, who the president is, right? So there have been such cooperation. In fact, that also brings up an interesting part, right? So no matter what, when it comes to bilateral cooperation, India would still cooperate more with EU, US, the Western countries, because they are the ones who are pioneers of this technology rather than China, right? So because with China, there's issues of mistrust and all these other issues which come in the way of effective bilateral cooperation. So how it can be done, that is a difficult question to answer, because from my experience, as I mentioned, there are still a lot of issues with the regulatory environment, which sometimes leads to problems in how the two can collaborate, not just in India, even in the EU, right? So the EU itself is like a bureaucratic maze that way. There's just too many things that also come in the way of quick sort of partnerships that can be brought about. So there are a lot of delays. All these interests also come in the way. So, but you're right, R&D is an issue on which there will be more and more joint cooperation between EU, India, and other like-minded countries. In fact, yeah.
There is a question. Corey, do you
I
have
would like.
Okay, Veronica, just a minute. There is a question in chat box which I would like to take. Rishabh Balakrishna is asking, how can the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism safeguard the rights of developing nations to develop instead of making trade a costly affair for these countries?
Yeah.
Carbon border tax.
Yeah. As of now, in its current state, it will just make it more costly affair for developing countries. How it can, I mean, of course, there are ways in which it can be made, like, it can safeguard the rights. And that will, of course, involve, again, more and more climate finance, capacity building from the EU countries in these countries as to how this has to be carried out. Climate finance has to be, of course, from the state. Not the, as of now, as I mentioned, there is a lot of private finances which are coming. But if they plan to impose this kind of tax, it has to be from the state. You can't expect the other actors to, fill the gap. So yes, if they have to kind of still respect CBDR-RC principle, it has to be backed up by technological and financial transfer. That is the only way the rights can be safeguarded. So it's not like the carbon border adjustment mechanism is good for the EU countries, but if it is done without the consultation, that is another problem that the EU is facing right now. They are implementing some of these issues, some of these measures without consulting the other stakeholders, right? So proper consultation with the developing countries also has to be done. It's just like how they just suddenly decided to ban palm oil and biofuels without consulting their partners in Malaysia, Indonesia, and other palm oil countries or producing countries. So this consultation is very important. Second, as I mentioned, they have to live up to their promises of financial and technological transfer, which is critical, right? So, and the third is, of course, capacity building and training, because most of the time, if you look at India and many other any developing country, there's not enough training to actually carry out these kind of audit and monitoring, evaluation. All these different stages involve a lot of technical knowledge, which obviously you can't expect the people from here to learn over a period of time, and then during that time we just have to pay more for whatever our exports are. That is not going to be, that is obviously, again, violation of the rights of developing countries within the climate regime. And very importantly, yeah, this particular, whatever safeguard, whatever mechanism they're trying to bring about or implement has to be tied to the UNFCCC. If it is not, again, this is kind of violation of the climate order itself. It's a, kind of, violation of the climate regime and whatever the principles have been laid out internationally. So, so those are some of the important measures that the EU will have to take into consideration.
Veronica, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask your opinion in terms of policy of national development. What shall Indian government do more or has not done enough in order to increase his leadership in the international trades of climate change and green technology? Thank you.
Yeah, of course, as I mentioned, any effort to show a country as a responsible power at the international level will have to involve a lot more efforts at the domestic level, show that we are doing a lot. So I think renewable energy is definitely one area. I think we are already doing enough. We have, we are in a good position to achieve all our targets. Even under the Paris Agreement, whatever goals we have set, it looks like, we are going to achieve them. But there is a problem with these goals, is that we probably are underselling ourselves in the sense that we can probably achieve more, which is why at the Glasgow Summit, Modi kind of, stepped up a little bit more and declared much bigger goals, which was not the case in the nationally determined contributions that we had announced earlier. What we can do, what we need to do further, I think one area where we are still lagging behind, just transition. So if we are to, phase down coal, which is what we have agreed to, at least, that we are going to not phase out, but at least phasing down coal eventually. And in fact, our investments in coal projects have also come down significantly in comparison to the renewable energy projects over the years. But just transition is something that is very critical to how we are going to transition ourselves. How the coal communities, other communities that are dependent on fossil fuel projects, how do you, re-employ them? How do you make sure that their rights are protected? These are things that will have to be taken care of. I think we are still lagging behind when it comes to adaptation. In India, we don't have much investments in climate adaptation. How are we going to cope with more and more disasters? How are our cities going to cope with disasters? I think we are still figuring out, our disaster risk reduction policies. We have policies in place, but the way we are implementing them requires a massive kind of overhaul. Because as of now, we are just, bringing in incremental measures to support our policies. We need more of a transformative approach in that sense. We still are lagging behind on, as I mentioned, disaster risk reduction that way. And of course, just transition is something that we are just looking into as of now. I think one of the areas where we are getting a hit in terms of our image as a responsible climate player is the way we deal with environmental NGOs, right? So these are a massive part of India's climate, policy. Many NGOs are involved in how climate change measures are implemented. And if the government is seen as some, if government is seen to be taking action against environmental NGOs, this again brings up a lot of problems with respect to our image at the international level, which is something that has been reiterated time and again. There are many other issues which we will have to figure out. R&D is one area which already I mentioned, which is lagging behind. And I think in that, the only way we can make bigger steps, or we can take bigger steps, is through cooperation with other countries. Because our capacity is much lower at this stage, including in the manufacturing sector, right? So our manufacturing sector is still not like massive like China, right? So we still kind of depend on many of these things. So in that sense, there are a lot of things to be done. At one sector where we are going in the right direction, I would say, is renewable energy. But there's water, there's food, all these other interlinked sectors which require as much attention. So if you look at the National Action Plan on Climate Change, there are different missions in that. The two missions which are working well are solar mission, of course, and the energy efficiency mission. Because we have brought in policies like Bureau of Energy Efficiency is also working towards industrial efficiency, building efficiency, all those things. You look at the other missions like Himalayan ecosystem, then sustainable habitat mission is there. I don't know, so many other, health mission is there. All these missions have still not taken off as expected. So there's a lot that needs to be done in all the other missions which are lagging behind in terms of the goals which we have set for ourselves.
Thank you. Hitesh, before I move to you, there's one thing I was wondering and I want to ask. With this movement and this rapid movement towards green technology, most of these technologies require rare earth materials, and China is like have the maximum capacity to deliver in this thing. But again, there is this dilemma that most of the countries, especially EU with its Green Deal and everything, they don't want to be over dependent on China when it comes to anything.
Yeah.
Right. So where else they will look for rare earth? Latin America, Africa, maybe Southeast Asia. So what I want to point out here is, do you think that this kind of movement, this kind of energy transition, and the speed with which we are moving towards green technology and the lack of resources which developed countries have, it again kind of might lead to this climate colonialism in these resource cursed countries of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia?
Yeah.
What's your assessment of that?
No, that is a very valid point, because energy transition is not all good. Energy transition on the outside as a climate solution, it's great. But then beyond that, you look at what kind of effects it has. You are going to have a massive extractive industry, which will, keep mining for rare earths. We're already seeing effects of the mining of coltan in Congo. It's already leading to massive conflicts between communities. It is affecting their health. There's a lot of problems, ethnic conflicts related to these mining activities as well. So in fact, it is also happening in other African countries where, I'm just giving one example, but this is happening in other African countries as well, where you have these big industrial conglomerates which are engaged in extractive activities. Not just Chinese, but other, European, American, Canadian companies as well, which are responsible for pollution, human rights abuses, and other things. This is not just China. So, this is a problem with the energy transition movement as well. There are massive security implications, which also need to be dealt with. Today we are, building so much hype around electric vehicles, and we need lithium ion batteries and other things. Where is that going to come from? So, slowly more and more restrictions are going to come as far as land extraction is, extraction of minerals on land is concerned. Then you shift to the sea. That's why we are talking about the blue economy now, where, so you can extract more from the seabed or something like that. There's already seabed mining, which is happening in like Pacific Islands, which are also facing the, consequences, the negative consequences of mining activities as well on the seabed, because marine species get affected. So there are massive gaps in terms of research as to how the energy transition is may have very negative consequences as well. You look at the lithium ion batteries, whatever, imagine like the whole world kind of transitions very fast, like in the next 10 years, we're going to see this large scale use of EVs everywhere. These batteries, where are you going to dump them? They're not reusable. Many of them are not reusable. Many of them are not recyclable either. So we have to find a way to reuse, recycle them, and make them more sustainable and efficient that way. We can't be like, we can't think about it at that time when we are, we have too much to handle, right? So I think this call for rapid energy transition without thinking about how these other problems can come about, and there again, colonialism, climate colonialism can be a factor, because we have experience of dumping of this hazardous waste in the waters of developing countries. This has happened in the past. It may happen in the future also. Right. So I think a couple of years ago, Malaysia returned like a ship of toxic waste, which was sent by Canada. So this is still happening, right? So the reason why developed countries are still kind of clean and they are able to recycle all their material is because they are sending most of the non-recyclable toxic materials to the developing countries. That is why they are still, very environment friendly and climate friendly and all of that. So, this is going to be a form of climate colonialism as well. And because energy transition is something that is being dictated, these ideas are being dictated by the Western countries. Again, we are kind of falling into that dictums of what an energy transition should look like, how it should be done, who are the actors who can be there. These are things which will again, form that kind of cycle of colonialism itself, or the practice of neo-colonialism for that matter. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hitesh, you got your chance. Let me first ask Priya and then I'll come to you. Priya, please.
Yeah, Dhanasree, since I think Yatha that just pointed out, since we are on the topic of CAP, the colonialism, climate colonialism itself, I was just thinking that if you see the most popular narrative that at least the West, of course led by the West, has been that we need to change our production pattern, right? This entire thing about transition. But if you actually see today, the biggest challenges that we face when it comes to climate change is actually the increased consumption pattern.
Yeah.
Right? How do you see? It's just like we are trying to replace the brown capitalism of the present with the green capitalism. Like it's just between the existing capitalism. The model remains the same.
Yeah.
Right? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so you've just hit the nail on the head. Basically, I mean, this is what actually, funnily, Prime Minister Modi also keeps talking about this. Every time he goes to any climate summit or anything, he says the problem is with the consumer behavior. Consumer behavior needs to change in the Western countries if we are to have a sustainable solution or whatever for climate change. That is not going to be easy. Because, I mean, just imagine trying to change consumer behavior in the United States. That's impossible. People are going to revolt there. The moment you try to change their lifestyle, because it's a very individualistic society where everybody wants to have their rights to do things in their own way, whatever. It's the same in most countries of Europe as well. When you are used to, say, like, very individualistic society where you are, you have a certain lifestyle that you cannot compromise upon, it's very difficult to think of, the changing that consumerist behavior. I wouldn't say consumer, it's actually consumerist behavior, right? I mean, that is why India keeps insisting on this behavioral patterns or whatever behavior, consumer behavior in India that way is much more environment friendly any day as compared to these Western countries. But we have to keep in mind that consumer behavior in India is also changing. Right, so slowly that modernist kind of idea of what a lifestyle looks like, what is the standard of living, these kind of ideas have percolated into the Indian society as well. So we have, I mean, India is like a mix of everything. You'll find all kinds of, communities with different kinds of behavioral patterns. So, the consumer behavior needs to change. I think in some ways it is changing in Europe, because you can see at least, at least the young sections of the population, at least you will find that, they don't want to buy a car. They depend on public transportation. They'll travel by train only across countries in Europe. So this kind of, a lot of them are turning vegan or whatever, so this vegan movement, which you will find as well. So yes, there is greater realization of the fact that yes, consumer behavior needs to change. But imagine Europe without heating, which is kind of based on natural gas, which is a fossil fuel. Of course, it is cleaner than coal and whatever, but then it's still gas-based heating systems. Imagine that's not going to be very easy to change. So which is why per capita consumption of energy and per capita emissions in these countries is still huge in comparison to India. But we have to think of equity at all levels. At the level of international, but also at the domestic. So in India also, who is really contributing to most of the emissions? Like we say, India is the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. I'm sure, I don't know the correct figures, but definitely, there are just 2 or 3 sectors which are contributing to most of these emissions, and large sections of population who don't even have 24 hours access to electricity. How do you account them for greenhouse gas emissions? How are you going to divide whatever incentives or whatever? So this is something that we have to think about as well, and this is something that remains like a red line as far as international climate politics is concerned, that very few countries touch upon it. India is actually one of them which talks about the consumer behavior, but the Western countries generally tend to disregard it.
One last question, Hitesh, please go ahead, and then we wrap up.
I just have since you guys have actually put question, I just have a comment about, since we talked about inequality and all that in the last 2 questions, it really does make sense. And when we talk about inequality, it also, it's not just the climate colonialism, it's also, inequalities that creates within a country as well. For example, the whole idea of veganism, which has a whole caste narrative as well into it, goes hand in hand, and it creates a very different inequalities within Indian social structure. And there is a moral policing attached to that, and then there is the fact is that when we talk about this sudden transition, it's not just like some other country, but also it's basically the elites still somehow manage to fit into it. So so-called middle class bourgeoisie or the upper class elites still manage to fit into the modern change of the manage to be part of this commodity fetishism, but but the bottom ones are still trying to just manage to survive. So
yeah. No, that is, you talk about veganism in Europe, which is actually growing quite a lot. Again, it's mostly sort of, as you mentioned, these are like the elite movements mostly. Now you talk about veganism and, one of the major exporters, many African countries, in fact, export meat to Europe. They are dependent on these meat exports for, their own trade surpluses or whatever. The moment you say, oh, we are going to ban meat and we are going to stop eating meat, what happens to all these countries that have been exporting meat to Europe and are dependent on the revenues generated from that, just like in the case of palm oil, right? So you create that dependency, and then you kind of for whatever moral reasons or whatever you want to cut it off, without thinking of how it's going to impact another country. So there are countries in Africa where agriculture it's not possible because of the extreme drought like conditions that they face continuously, right? So the only thing they can engage in is livestock industry primarily for exporting meat to other countries like European countries. So you have to think about their interests as well. Like if you're just going to say, yeah, veganism is good for climate and environment, and I'm going to stop eating meat, and suddenly you put a ban on exported meat, which is something imported meat. What happens to all these countries then? So these are issues which, again, like I mentioned, the EU tends to implement or whatever, launch without consulting all the stakeholders. They need to learn the art of consultation and engagement in a way that also kind of understands the others. So they took a lot of time to understand the interests of India. That shift essentially happened also because of that understanding of interests. Now that has to happen at whichever kind of policy is introduced.
Thank you so much, everyone. We have reached the end of this first session of day 4. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram for so graciously accepting our invitation and for sharing her valuable time and insights with us. It was a pleasure to have you here at MCES, and we are really looking forward to many more such engagements. Thank you, Dr. Dhanasree.